Hello, my name is Steve Hare. I am a school social worker for Keystone Area Education Agency and a trainer in the Oveus Bullying Prevention Program. This particular PowerPoint training, Bullying for Paraprofessionals, is not a training or a pitch for the Oveus Bullying Prevention Program. This training is based on the Oveus program principles and research, however, but the program itself is much more extensive. While you will hopefully find the information useful in your settings, the research has demonstrated that a building-wide adoption of a bullying prevention program is necessary to make a real impact in reducing bullying. This presentation is 42 slides long for those of you keeping track, and you may pause when you'd like. I'll direct pauses periodically, assuming you are not viewing it alone, for some sharing among yourselves. If you are viewing this individually, feel free to disregard the pauses and continue at your own pace. Before I go any further, I need to acknowledge the individuals who are responsible for the content of this program. Dan Oveus is a Swedish psychologist and researcher who was commissioned by the government of Norway in the 1980s to develop a program to address bullying. This happened after the suicides of a few junior high school students, which were determined to have been preceded by bullying, which by the way is called mobbing in European countries. Dan Oveus subsequently developed the program, and it has been adopted by numerous European schools. He's considered the father of bullying research. Sue Limber at Clemson University in South Carolina is the American who was responsible for its introduction and development in the United States in the early 1990s. The Oveus Bullying Prevention Program has subsequently been adopted by hundreds of U.S. schools and has trained a large network of trainers, including many in Iowa. Before I move on to share the information that has been gathered from tons of research, we'll take a few minutes to take stock of our own beliefs. Before we can really effectively respond to bullying ourselves in our work settings, we need to consider our own attitudes and beliefs about who is involved, about what bullying is, what it looks like, when and where it's likely to occur, how it affects us, and why it continues. Okay, I'll make the loop around the circle of questions, starting with who. You can pause after each, and if you're alone, you can just jot down your own responses, or just say them aloud to yourself. If you're part of a group, you might share aloud, or share from your list, or make a combined list on paper. Don't filter your answers, just write a statement of what you think. We'll address as we go along what are facts and what are commonly believed myths. So first of all, let's look at the who. Who are students who bully, and who are students who are bullied? Pause and think a second. Okay, let's look at the what. What kind of behaviors do you think of when you hear the word bullying? Okay, next, the where and when. Where and when do you think bullying occurs? And don't restrict yourself to just a school setting, and even within a school setting. Think of all the possible times, settings, locations bullying does occur. Where is it more likely to occur? Where is it less likely to occur? How do you think bullying continues? I guess that's a why as well. And finally, why do you think students bully? There is a reason. There are multiple reasons actually, but what do you feel? All right, some of the answers to these questions are facts and some are just myths. Societal attitudes and misconceptions about bullying surround us, and they play a role in how we respond and even whether we respond when we see it happening. We'll be looking more closely at these ideas during our training. So let's continue. Here's the definition of bullying that was arrived at by Dan Olweus and pretty much accepted throughout the field. Bullying is when someone repeatedly and on purpose says or does mean or hurtful things to another person who has a hard time defending himself or herself. We want to be careful to avoid using terms like bully and victim as much as possible when describing students. We want to avoid labels and focus on the behavior. Bullying is something that people do and something that happens to other individuals. We encourage this practice with all staff in our schools. So this definition has three key components. First is that bullying is a form of aggression, and it's not necessarily just physical aggression. We'll elaborate on that in a little bit. Behavior is often repeated, though adults often aren't aware of patterns until a serious event occurs. Do not feel you need to wait to see a pattern developing before responding. Address all negative behavior immediately, whether you discover lately that it was or was not in fact bullying. Unlike other forms of aggression, there's an imbalance of power or strength between a child who is bullying and a child who is being bullied. A real fight or rough and tumble horseplay involve aggression, but there's some distinctive characteristics between those kinds of aggression and bullying. The imbalance of power can be physical, but often it is emotional or verbal, and it can be quite subtle, depending on the circumstance and the relationship between the students. In any event, the result is a child who is being bullied, and he's likely to have a difficult time defending himself or herself, whether it's physically, verbally, or emotionally. Bullying is a form of victimization or peer abuse, and it shares some characteristics with other forms of victimization such as domestic violence and child abuse. They're all repetitive. They all involve a power imbalance in the relationship. Bullying isn't a form of conflict, which implies that two parties who are on a more equal footing, responding to bullying as if it were a conflict between equals can be damaging, because this may send the wrong message to the children involved or re-victimize the child who was bullied. We'll talk about this more a bit later when we address common misdirections in bullying prevention and intervention. There are generally two categories of bullying, direct and indirect. Adults are most familiar with direct bullying, and we're most likely to respond to it. There are things that are done face-to-face. Examples are hitting, taunting, name-calling, threats, physical intimidation. Most school conduct policies focus on direct forms of bullying. The power imbalance in direct bullying is usually pretty obvious too to the observer. It may involve physical size or strength, social status, the numbers of bullying students involved. If you've got one student who's outnumbered by a number of other students, that's a power imbalance. The intelligence or confidence level of the bullying student versus the bullied student, that's another form of power imbalance. Bullying can also be more subtle or indirect. Rumors, spreading rumors, excluding individual students or small groups of students from social activities, social circles, sitting at your lunch table, other activities. Cyberbullying is sort of a new frontier for bullying. That's real difficult for schools to discover and address. Power imbalance and the reason it's difficult to discover sometimes is it's frequently done anonymously. It impacts a wide audience and involves social shame and humiliation for the bullied student because of what's posted online, and the audience is huge. Behaviors like rough and tumble play and real fighting between students are often confused with bullying, and that's a problem if we respond to all behaviors of these behaviors the same way. Rough and tumble play, horseplay, is typically when two or more students will hit, push, chase, and wrestle, but in a friendly, playful manner. This differs from bullying in the relationship between the parties and the expression and atmosphere. Real fighting differs from bullying in the repeated nature of the behavior and the imbalance of power, both of which are typically absent in bullying. There's some characteristics that can help us sort out physical behaviors and help us sort out more subtle forms of bullying. You don't need to memorize this whole list, but let me just run down a list here of characteristics and how the three different kinds of behaviors, rough and tumble play, real fighting, and bullying, differ from one another, or in some situations are similar, but they still have some distinguishing characteristics. Role switching, for example. With rough and tumble play, typically who is the dominant superior one and who is the inferior one will switch back and forth. They will deliberately let each other take the upper hand because it's all in fun. Real fighting, you don't generally see that. Each is out to dominate, to win the fight. Bullying, there is no role switching. It's pretty clear based on the relationship, based on the interaction, who is the beneficiary of the imbalance of power. The characteristic of self-imposed limiting of your own strength. Rough and tumble play, neither party really wants to hurt the other. They may land light blows or slap, but they're not really going to hurt this person who is their friend. In real fighting, you got two parties who really want to hurt one another. They might refrain from crossing some really awful line for fear of hurting someone seriously, which would get them in big trouble. Not that getting into a fight doesn't get them into real trouble, but generally they're not going to limit their own strength beyond a minor degree. With bullying, there's also not really a limitation of one's own superiority and strength. The point is to establish your dominance, your superiority over the person being bullied. The characteristic of gathering of bystanders. Rough and tumble play might be amusing for some bystanders, some kids in the area, but generally they know the two are horsing around and not really going to stick around to see who comes out on top. With a real fight, you've got bystanders. You've got an audience who wants to see the outcome of this pretty dramatic incident. With bullying, bystanders play a pretty significant role. If the bullying's open and visible, and it's not always, sometimes it's a fairly subtle interaction between the bullying and the bullied students, but a lot of bullying behavior does have and does gather an audience. With rough and tumble play, relations immediately after the episode. Typically the two parties, when they're done doing their horsing around, they'll go off together and engage in some mutual activity. With real fighting and bullying, generally the participants are going to leave one another. The dominant one, the one at the top of the power imbalance, has made his or her point and leaves feeling somewhat satisfied. The person being bullied they don't want to be there in the first place. And when it's over, they're going to leave the scene or remain in the scene if the bullying student does choose to leave. Other characteristics, the relationship between the parties. Rough and tumble play, horseplay, it's between kids who are friends. With a real fight and with bullying, the participants are typically, they're not friends. Number of participants, rough and tumble play, generally you've got 2 kids, sometimes more. Real fight, you're usually talking 2 individuals. And with bullying, it's typically 2, but often might be a group of 2 or 3 against the one bullied student. Balance of power and strength, it's typically equal with rough and tumble play. If there is an imbalance between a clearly stronger, larger student and a smaller, less strong one, generally that imbalance is deliberately adjusted. So the stronger one is not going to exploit that. They just want to have fun and trade pretty much evenly in terms of the physical superiority between the 2. Real fighting, balance of power and strength, it can vary, but often it's relatively equal. And bullying, well, that's part of the definition. There is an imbalance in strength and power. Rough and tumble play, generally the participants are clearly mutually enjoying themselves. They're going to smile, they're going to laugh, they're going to be friendly. Real fighting, you've got both parties, staring, glaring, serious face, tense, hostile. Bullying, the inferior party, is often sad, depressed, crying, angry, despairing. May see flashes of anger, but it's sort of fruitless because the dominance is there on the part of the bullying student. Superior party, the expression may vary, but often it involves laughter, scornful smiles, or serious. It's definitely not friendly. The underlying intention of rough and tumble play, friendly and positive. Real fighting, it's negative, it's aggressive, and there's a desire to inflict injury or discomfort. With bullying, it's also negative and aggressive. Sometimes a desire to actually inflict injury or discomfort, definitely to humiliate and insult. Rough and tumble play is typically repeated. It's a fun activity, and they will do it repeatedly. A real fight, generally, that's a one-time thing that's not going to happen repeatedly, and bullying, that does happen repeatedly between the parties. So, why do we even bother to address bullying in schools? Well, we've got a whole bunch of reasons. Probably most important is for students and their futures. Bullying behaviors are bad in a number of ways for students who bully, for students who are bullied, and for the bystanders, which pretty much covers everybody. The next couple slides, we're going to look at this piece in a little more detail. Number 2, healthy school climate. In case you haven't noticed, school improvement, student performance academically is a real priority for schools. And healthy school climates can improve achievement. Unhealthy climates suppress achievements, and that's something that schools want to avoid. For the larger community, when students like school and have a variety of settings where they feel they belong, and bullying does impact whether students feel they belong or not, that's better for the community in a variety of ways. Number 4, risk management. You know, in recent years, the number of civil suits brought by students and parents against schools has grown. If school personnel can be demonstrated to have failed to provide a safe learning environment, that's a pretty large financial risk and liability risk for schools. I'm sure you've read some of these stories in the paper. the worst ones involving student suicides, but even the less drastic situations. Schools have a legal obligation to provide a safe environment for their students. Number 5, it's also wise financially, not just for the schools, but for society in general. Bullying prevention programs could save the country, the research estimates, between $1.7 million and $2.3 million by keeping at-risk youth out of the justice system. There's a real risk of involvement in the justice system by students who get into a habit of bullying behaviors in school, and they extend into relationships and situations out of school. So that's another reason. So let's look at some of the effects of being bullied. Bullying can seriously affect kids' mental health and social functioning, their academic work, the health of kids who are targeted, and these can be both short-term and long-term effects. Being bullied is related to lower self-esteem in kids, higher depression rate, loneliness, anxiety, none of which are things we want in kids. Kids who are bullied are more likely to report wanting to avoid school, which of course leads to higher absenteeism rates, which then will have a ripple effect because they're missing instruction. Kids report disliking school for a whole range of reasons, but we're talking bullying right now. Disliking school for whatever reason results in lower grades generally. Early peer exclusion, as early as kindergarten, interestingly enough, based on research, leads to decreased classroom participation, and in turn, this results in lowered academic achievement by 5th grade. Kids who are bullied report more suicidal ideation than peers who are not bullied. And while suicide is actually rare, it's been linked to persistent bullying. I think it's interesting when you recall my description of Dan Olweus being commissioned by the government of Norway to develop this program. A couple of student suicides was enough to motivate an entire country to decide we're not going to tolerate this anymore. And that's why they commissioned this program, the Olweus program. Suicidal ideation and depression appear more common among children experiencing indirect bullying, like being ignored, than kids who are directly bullied. And depression and low self-esteem can persist into adulthood. Okay, let's take a look, for those of you who love numbers and percentages and some statistics. Kids who are frequently bullied report a variety of health problems. This is based on a study of Dutch school children. I told you bullying prevention is really big in Europe. They've done a lot of research there. That study found that among bullied children, ages 9 to 12 was the focus of this study. And these are kids who are bullied a few times a month or more. Those kids were more likely than peers to experience a variety of physical ailments. They were 3 times as likely as non-bullied peers to have headaches, twice as likely to have problems sleeping, to have abdominal pain and to be tense, 3 times as likely to be anxious, 5 times as likely to be unhappy, and much more depressed. So, bullying isn't just briefly, socially awkward or embarrassing. It's bad for your health. So let's take a look at concerns we have about kids who bully. It's not just the bullied students we want to save. There's reasons to be concerned about children who bully their peers. Researchers have found that bullying behavior is related to other antisocial, violent, or troubling behaviors. Bullying students are more likely than their non-bullying peers to get into frequent fights, to be injured in a fight, to steal, vandalize property, to drink alcohol and smoke, be truant, drop out of school, to do more poorly academically, and just perceive a negative climate at school, even if they're responsible for that climate, they don't find that climate pleasant themselves. They're also more likely to carry a weapon, perhaps not at the moment, but in the future if they develop that kind of way of relating to the people around them. As citizens, that causes some concerns for us who interact with these students, whether it's in our job or whether they're our neighbors or just living in our community. To continue, frequent or persistent bullying behavior commonly is considered to be part of a conduct disordered behavior pattern, which may continue into young adulthood if not checked. I worked for a number of years in the domestic abuse batterers education program, and I heard about this exact same kind of behavior which takes place with intimate partners. So it's a pattern of interacting which starts as a child and can continue into adulthood. A study in Norway found that 60% of boys identified as bullying in the middle school had at least one conviction by the age of 24. 35 to 40% of these kids had 3 or more convictions. Kids who bullied repeatedly were 3 to 4 times as likely as their non-bullying peers to have multiple convictions by their early 20s. This study only included boys, but similar patterns may hold true for girls. So again, it's better for society for us to try to interrupt this, as well as being better for those students. So, our much earlier question of why focus on bullying in the schools? Well, we've talked about how bullying affects children who are bullied. We've got concerns for children who do the bullying. But another big reason is the effect that bullying may have on bystanders or witnesses, that large, silent, or perhaps not so silent potential majority of students. Children who observe bullying going on around them might feel afraid for what's about to happen to one of their classmates who's being bullied, might be afraid for themselves. They might feel that they're next in line. They could feel powerless to change the situation. They're aware of the power imbalance between the bullying student and the bullied student. That same power imbalance may also exist between the bullying student and this bystander, this witness. And bystander may feel powerless to change the situation because what chance do they have taking on a bullying student? But then again, they might feel guilty for not acting. They've heard from teachers, from parents, our moral obligation to stand up for what's right, to defend people. If they don't do so, for understandable reasons they wouldn't do so, but might feel guilt afterwards. Another risk is diminished empathy for victims over time. They may conclude that, well, this kid's got it coming. He is sort of weird, he is sort of goofy, he is sort of strange, or she, and maybe that's just the way those kids are treated and should be treated socially. So all told, we have a whole collection of negative impacts of bullying on a school climate. You've got students who are perhaps fearful, disrespectful of one another, has an impact on student learning. Students can feel insecure and just not like school as well. And they may perceive a lack of control and caring by the adults. The adults are supposed to maintain control, maintain standards, hold students accountable. If this isn't happening, that has an additional negative impact on the climate at the school, none of which we want. So ultimately, protecting students from bullying, it's a question of basic human rights. We strive to protect kids from bullying not just because we're concerned about lawsuits, but because kids should have the right to attend school in a non-threatening environment where they're treated with dignity and respect, and not just from the adults, but from their peers. And they also learn that they have an obligation to treat one another with dignity and respect too. So, we've talked for a while about the impact of bullying on students, both who do it and who are on the receiving end. Let's talk about some of the characteristics of bullied students and then bullying students. And I want to acknowledge the next couple slides have the terms victim in there, which, again, I want to remind you that's not our preferred term. I prefer to use the term bullied students or targeted students. Anyway, there are two categories of bullied children generally, referred to as passive or submissive victims, or what we can call provocative victims, or bully victims. The literature refers to students as submissive or passive or provocative, but these are descriptors that exist in the literature. Don't interpret this as blaming these students for being bullied. So, passive victims, or I'm going to call them passive targets of bullying, usually have one or more of these characteristics. They tend to be cautious, sensitive, quiet, withdrawn, tend to be more anxious, insecure, have low self-esteem. You're familiar with these kids. You've seen them in your work settings. Boys may be physically weaker than their male peers. Girls may be physically maturing earlier. These kids have fewer friends. They find it easier to associate with adults because adults are generally more accepting and kind and less inclined to be cruel, unlike some of their classmates. Some of these characteristics may be seen as both contributing factors or causes. And I want to remind you, cause does not mean blame. Could be contributing factors as well as consequences of being a target. For example, if a child feels insecure, his or her behavior may signal them as an easy target. And that's also likely to shake their confidence further if they're receiving regular bullying. So that's an example of insecurity being both a cause and a consequence of bullying. Remember not to blame the victim or the target. No child deserves to be bullied, and bullied students are not responsible for the bullying. Students who bully are responsible for the behaviors that they choose. Okay, so let's take a look at these provocative victims, these bully victims is another term. Those students who comprise a smaller group than the passive targets. About 10 to 20% of bullied students are in this category here. They're difficult to deal with because they display social emotional problems of the victimized kids. They're depressed, they're socially anxious, they have poor self-esteem, they're socially isolated, and they feel disliked by their peers, but they frequently have behavior problems that are similar to students who do bullying. They're aggressive, they're antisocial, they have difficulty concentrating, they're impulsive, they're more likely to be hyperactive and have ADHD characteristics. They might try to bully weaker students, but they're not as effective at doing so than other kids who bully, who have more confidence and frequently more social skills and adeptness at it. These provocative targets, provocative victims, behavior might cause irritation and tension in not just their peers, but in adults like us as well. That results in a lot of negative attention because they're frequently being corrected by us for misbehavior. That's not necessarily bullying, but they've got some social stigma they experience because of their misbehavior. but there's still no evidence that they want to provoke others or be bullied. It's just how it plays itself out because of their poor social skills and poor social judgment. Some kids are at particularly high risk of being bullied because of ways they're perceived as being different. Sometimes these differences might be viewed as positive, like being gifted or talented, in which case peers as well as adults view this as positive, though I want to acknowledge some of those gifted and talented kids might be viewed negatively by their less gifted, less talented peers who may resent them and target them for bullying. But sometimes the differences may be viewed as negative by both kids and adults. Some examples of that are shown in the slide. It includes kids with disabilities, whether learning, cognitive, or other disabilities, special needs kids, kids with health problems, kids who are obese are a real common target. So the above group includes kids with ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, like Asperger's, kids with other medical conditions that affect their appearance, perhaps, kids with diabetes, stuttering, similar medical conditions that are obvious to peers. Nationwide, adults who are not part of the heterosexual majority have made a lot of legal and social headway in the last few years. In schools, however, where kids aren't always aware of the evolving societal norms, the issue of sexual orientation remains a factor in bullying. So kids who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or who are questioning their identities are subject to bullying. We need to be aware of this and recognize that bullying based on these characteristics is still not acceptable. Although there's no single profile of kids who bully, several of those kids tend to have positive attitudes toward violence. They tend to be impulsive and have quick tempers, aren't very strong suited in having empathy for the kids who they bully. They're sometimes aggressive to adults. And aggression doesn't necessarily mean physically intimidating, just disrespectful in various ways. They might be involved in other antisocial or rule-breaking activities, either in the school or in the community. Boys in particular tend to be physically stronger than peers. Not all students who bully have obvious behavior problems or are engaged in antisocial or rule-breaking activities besides bullying. Some are real skilled socially with teachers and other adults and can talk themselves out of sticky situations. This social status that they get by being fairly articulate and confident sometimes contributes to the power imbalance they have over kids who just don't have those kind of skills, don't have that level of confidence. So sometimes it is difficult for adults to discover or even imagine that some of these kids are bullying others. The last few months, some professional athletes in the news are an illustration of how a skilled, socially adept individual who's capable of some aggressive behaviors can exploit their advantage in a relationship where they have an advantage in a power imbalance. Well, way back at slide number 3, when I asked you to pause and go through the who, what, when, where, why, hows of bullying, a couple of the common myths about who those kids are who bully are children who bully are loners. Actually, research indicates kids who bully are not socially isolated for the most part, and they may be viewed by others as popular. They have an easier time making friends than peers. They typically are less depressed, less socially anxious, and less lonely than their peers. They generally are average or somewhat below average in popularity among the large group of peers, but they have at least a small group of friends, and we're going to use the word henchmen in a couple of slides, peers who support their bullying behavior. So what that means is that the way we respond to bullying, our interventions had to focus not only on those kids who bully and those supporters, those henchmen, but on the bystanders who support it inadvertently, but by their actions they are supportive. Another common myth is children who bully have low self-esteem. Actually, kids who bully have average or above average self-esteem. That's one of the reasons they feel confident enough to engage in that kind of behavior and exploit a power imbalance. They're aware that they have an advantage in some sense in a relationship with their bullied, targeted peer. So the implications of this myth is that self-esteem building for kids who bully can have negative consequences. It would just reinforce their bullying behavior. They already have plenty of self-esteem, perhaps too much so. So, why do kids bully? If it's not because they're insecure, and it's not because they're depressed, and they're not competing for grades, some motives are typically, some of these kids just may have a strong need for dominance and power, and they like to be in control and subdue others. Others may find some satisfaction in causing injury and suffering. And sometimes home environment contributes to this, and we'll talk about that a couple of slides down the line. Some kids may actually get material or psychological rewards for their behavior. With the audience, they get to perform and come out on top, winning this contest, which really isn't a contest at all. Some of them may benefit by getting things, the old traditional cliche of taking the lunch money, or some of their belongings from the student who's bullied. So those are some common factors. Well, by my calculations, we're at about 41 minutes. We're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about this particular slide. So if you want to take a break, pause and come back in 5-10 minutes, feel free, or you could wait till the end. But let's talk about this. This is called the bullying circle. When I saw this personally made the scales fall from my eyes when I recognized all the parts, all the roles that individuals play when a bullying situation occurs. These are the direct participants as well as the bystanders. This is arranged just for the sake of ease of portrayal, because typically you don't have a circle of people or a semicircle of people surrounding an individual who's being bullied. But this sure helps explain what parts individuals play. As I walk around this circle, I'll point out the student who is bullied is portrayed with the letter H in the middle of this circle. Starting at the upper left-hand corner and going counterclockwise, we have the students who bully, circle with A inside it. That's the person or persons who start the bullying and take an active part, exploiting that power imbalance. B are the followers, or henchmen is sometimes a term that's used. These are individuals who don't start it, but once it starts, they'll join in, take an active part, and perform as co-bulliers, partners with student A. C, circle C, supporters. They don't take an active part, but they're supportive. You could probably identify them if you were paying attention to all the bystanders as opposed to typically students A, B, and H, who are the ones who draw most of our attention. You could recognize the supporters by the ones who are smiling, giggling, watching actively as enthusiastic audience members. But they know enough not to jump in because they're aware of the risk of being seen as being active bullies. Circle D, passive supporters. They're also students who like to watch, but they don't display open support. They perhaps have the judgment to not even look like they're enthused. They want to watch, they want to see, but they're not going to dive in. They're not going to jump in. The disengaged onlookers, represented by circle E at the bottom, are those kids who are just on the scene and they really have no feelings either in favor of or opposed to the bullying. They notice, and I guess you can call them neutral, but we'll come back to them because that's a significant group that we want to target with our own intervention and prevention actions. Going around the circle, those students who were labeled possible defenders, the F circle, they see it, they don't like it, they know it's wrong. They think they ought to help, but they don't do it for various reasons. Maybe they don't know what to do. Maybe they have an idea of what they could do, but they're afraid. They may be reluctant to become the next sacrificial lamb and have students A, B, and maybe C turn on them. Upper right side, defenders. Those students who see it, they dislike it, and they take some action. Now that action might be just going to get an adult, getting some assistance, and recruiting an adult who they know will come in and stop. It may involve doing some strategic, some clever entrance in the scene and rescuing the student who's being bullied, quickly escort them away from their target position. Or it might be just, as soon as the bullying ends, we'll step in and do some kind of comforting of student H, of the student who's bullied, after the fact. It may involve doing some confrontation of students A and B, the followers. Now, an important thing to take away from this portrayal isn't just that, oh, okay, everybody plays a part. It's recognizing that whoever happens to be on the scene falls in one of these categories. And depending on who the student who is doing the bullying is and the followers, who the student is being bullied, your position in the circle may change. Someone who may take an active part as a follower in one situation may, in another situation, if somebody other than their pal, their friend, who is student A, is doing the bullying, and student H is someone that the kids who are in circle B, if that's a person who they perhaps are sympathetic to, they might be a possible defender. But when bullying happens, whoever's in the scene falls in one of those roles at that time during that situation. Now, the really interesting thing about this dynamic, this portrayal, is when bullying happens and adults witness it and do intervene, typically we're going to address students A and B and H. And all the other kids, all the other bystanders, the audience members, we will generally shoo off and say, go to class, get back to lunch, leave the scene, because having an audience, we know, is generally not a good thing. And we also don't want to have half a dozen or a dozen or more kids to have to interact with and deal with. We want to focus on the primary participants. The research illustrates that this is generally not an effective approach. Our hope, our expectation when we deal primarily with students A, B, and H is that we're going to respond, issue some consequence, confront in some way students A and B, and do something to have them not bully any longer. And perhaps with student H, not necessarily at the time, but in a follow-up, we're going to try to instill some social skills, some assertiveness skills, for that student to be able to stand up for themselves, say stop, leave the scene, go get help, something in that order, if bullying happens again. This typically ignores the reality that bullying involves a power imbalance, and we can't just inflate the self-confidence of a bullied student so they can stand up for themselves next time. That power imbalance is still there, and student H is going to be at a disadvantage. And students who bully and their followers, students A and B, and C to some extent too, I would say, they get too much social reinforcement, too much support from their peers to have us really expect that a lecture or a consequence or some other aversive response on our part is going to have those students just stop bullying and see the error in their ways. So what a whole school extensive bullying prevention program is going to do is shift the primary focus of their resources away from just A, B, and H, and focus a lot of energy to everybody else on the circle. Those students who are defenders, who have demonstrated that they can take the initiative and step in and do something, we're going to reinforce those students. We're going to supplement whatever skills they've developed on their own so that they do have a variety of options to choose from when they come upon a situation that involves bullying. There are some risks to confronting bullying students. Sometimes it is smarter to go get an adult to intervene. Sometimes, given the circumstances, there are adept, socially skilled ways to slide in and help H leave the scene. There's some research that has demonstrated that if anybody does something to interrupt bullying once it starts, the bullying generally stops within 10 seconds, which just fascinates me. And it doesn't necessarily have to be confronting student A and saying, knock it off, don't mess with my friend. So the defenders, you want to reinforce them and encourage them. Going clockwise, the possible defenders, students F down the line. Those students, you want to reinforce, strengthen that moral compass that's in their head, because they already dislike the bullying. They know there's something wrong with it and they should do something. You want to teach those kids what they can do, encourage them to do it, reinforce them when they do step up, step in, or go get an adult to intervene when they see something like this happening. So in effect, you want to slide those students, those possible defenders, from F on that circle up in the direction of G. The disengaged onlookers, which is a large number of students, you want to instill in them the recognition that, you know what, bullying is not a good thing. When you see it, it's not enough to just be neutral. You need to recognize that this is wrong, and you do have an obligation to do something. And perhaps your long-range goal with them is to try to teach them what to do. In effect, sliding them up in that counterclockwise direction towards where those possible defenders, those students in the F circle, are positioned, and maybe ultimately make them actual defenders. Moving those students counterclockwise along that bullying circle is actually what you're after for the other students as well. Those passive supporters who watch, they get some kind of satisfaction, perhaps instill a little discomfort, if not guilt in them, and make them realize, you know what, this is not really that funny. Even if I'm not taking an active part, they need to realize that by their failure to do something even if by failing to leave the scene, reducing the audience is something that will have an impact on students A and B. They count on having an audience who provides some kind of moral, even if not active, support. I hate to use the word moral, but that's, I think, the perspective of A and B. Supporters, student C, you want to slide them down too. Try to decrease the support that students A and B can count on before bullying even starts and when it is taking place. So if you can move the supporters and passive supporters down to even just a neutral position so that they're not quite as comfortable, not quite as amused watching this, and maybe long term moving them further up that circle and become possible defenders. The followers, those kids who take an active part after it starts, to have them be less inclined to join in and take part in the bullying, even if student A continues it. When student A loses some of that social status, some of that support for bullying behavior, that's perhaps going to decrease the likelihood that it's going to happen either as frequent or as prolonged or as intense. Students who bully and their active followers, they will receive a consequence. Part of the follow-up to an incident like this involves having individual conversations, follow-up in the building afterwards, and there will be some consequences issued. Student H, that student will also be talked to individually too, initially to get some facts about how this incident started. Has this happened before? That helps us establish a pattern to determine if in fact this is an ongoing bullying situation. And yes, we're going to provide student H some support, not so much to instill confidence in them, but to reassure them that, you know what, we're going to be paying attention to this. We know we have an obligation to prevent this from happening to you again. So we have to commit to being more diligent and being more attentive to both the student who is bullied and also to students A and B, those students who are doing the bullying. Another large preventive piece that the adults are doing, and this is part of a building-wide bullying prevention program. And as paraprofessionals, this call, this decision is way beyond you. But if you are in a building that has the Ulvaeus program, or in a building that has PBIS, which has a lot of similarities to the Ulvaeus program, both address school climate, and both, I think, focus on establishing respect for one another in a school. Both work at establishing interactions, choreographed, planned, positive interactions between students, so that, for example, students F and G and E, if they've got more invested in a relationship with student H, for example, they're going to be more inclined to actually do something in the defense of student H if they see that student being bullied. Students G, F, and E, if they have positive relationships, comfortable relationships with students who do bully, those A, B, and C students, they might be more confident in actually talking to those students, either beforehand, during, or afterwards, and trying to discourage them from such bullying behavior. And students A, B, C, D, if they have interactions and start to develop some kind of beginnings of a positive relationship with students who are bullied, they're less inclined to actually do bullying and pick on those students because they've got a positive relationship with them. And I know this is true in a lot of social situations, not just bullying. It's pretty hard to be mean to someone whom you know, who you've had a conversation with. It's much easier to be cruel, to be callous, to pick on someone who you don't really know, and it's easy to not have empathy for and to disregard their feelings. So establishing a school climate where there's respectful, positive interactions between all students is going to have a real significant impact on decreasing bullying. That's the value of looking at the bullying circle and recognizing the dynamics, the roles, and realizing that approaching situations with the traditional rescue the person on the receiving end and punish and therefore deter the guilty bullying students, if that had been the solution, we would have ended bullying years ago, because that's typically how we do address student misbehavior. A really interesting way to portray this, and this again is beyond your capacity as paraprofessionals, but when I've explained the bullying circle to an audience of, let's say 20 people or more, it's really revealing, it's really enlightening to be able to actually recreate the bullying circle with audience members. Actually position 8 people in this half circle with one person in the middle, and we've got little script cards for each individual describing some things they can say, and actually sit person H in a chair and surrounded by people in positions A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, and have each of them in turn talk out, act out. If they want to be a little theatrical and ham it up, that's perfectly fine. Act out their role and say what's going on in their minds, say what possible things they could actually verbalize. And it's interesting to ask the student who's being bullied, from their perspective, in this circle of people, this half circle surrounding them, where does it feel like the power is? Well, of course, their answer is going to be up on that right side of the circle, their right side, as they sit in position H facing outward. Persons A, B, and C, that's where it feels like the power lies, because that's where there are more people, that's where the active participation, the verbalization, is typically coming from. After going through each person's participation, it's interesting to ask the rest of the audience who are watching this. Think of the typical person, typical student in their school. Think of where they would be on that circle. And then ask the audience to get out of their seats and come up and stand behind that position in the circle that represents where they feel most students are. And invariably, you've got the vast bulk of audience participants lining up behind students F, E, and D to some extent. So visually, you're looking at just 1 or 2 people in positions A, B, C, a huge number of individuals who are lined up in the middle of the circle, and maybe another individual up in position G. And you look out and you ask the question, in fact, where is the power in this circle? And the power is clearly in the middle of the circle. A school climate program is going to focus most of our energies on students D, E, and F, and slowly try to shift them up towards student G. That's the solution to bullying. It's not just targeting A, B, and H. That's the value in this circle. There's some other interesting group mechanisms that take place in bullying situations that are worthwhile being aware of, that contribute to some social and non-aggressive students who otherwise wouldn't initiate bullying on their own, why they may participate in bullying. Something called social contagion. If bullying leaders are popular and admired, their behavior can become contagious, if you want to use that word, particularly for insecure students who are looking for some way to join in that same kind of status as the admired student A, the bullying student, the primary bullying student. It also possibly weakens inhibitions that we all would naturally have against aggression, especially if adults and other peers don't communicate that bullying is unacceptable. Bullying students is viewed as an acceptable thing to do. You lose that disinclination. It becomes seen as, well, that's the norm. Another interesting psychological dynamic that takes place is when several students participate, each individual student may feel less responsible and less guilty. There's a term for that called diffusion of responsibility, and that's been documented in a lot of cases, much more dramatic and extreme than bullying, but that's one of the dynamics that was cited by a number of people looking back in World War II in Germany, and how it was just a societal norm to treat Jewish people and other stigmatized groups poorly. Since everybody did it, no individual felt that it was really their fault. They didn't feel terribly guilty because they weren't doing this awful thing themselves. Also a change in view of the victim that goes along with this. Repeatedly bullied students may become sort of dehumanized. That's an extreme word, but just seem as less valuable or worthless, or seen as just asking to be bullied or blamed for their torment. Those kids who just become seen as at the bottom of the social ladder, low status, that of course, they deserve to be picked on. So along with this, those dynamics reduce feelings of empathy, they reduce feelings of guilt and personal responsibility, reduce feelings of remorse for their behavior. All those things are important to counteract bullying, but if they get diminished, that's going to encourage bullying to continue. That impacts the behavior and responses of both the students and the adults, and combined to just make a really unpleasant, if not toxic, school environment. There are some family dynamics that may place children at risk of bullying others. Risk factors include lack of parental warmth and involvement. As parents, we model caring, concern, empathy, compassion, kindness, and forgiveness with our kids. All these help kids learn what relationships should be like. Kids who experience these at home are more likely to manifest them with others. Lack of parental supervision and overly permissive parenting are factors too. When we're not paying attention to how our kids treat neighborhood kids, brothers and sisters, even other adults, and holding them responsible when they cross the line and stopping those behaviors, interrupting them. Overly permissive parenting. When we tolerate behaviors that impact others negatively and not hold our kids accountable for those, we miss the opportunity to instill awareness in our kids of the impact of their behaviors on others. Also, harsh discipline, harsh physical punishment illustrates to kids that it's okay to exploit the power imbalance that exists at home and disregard the hurtfulness, the discomfort, the disrespect that it feels like on the receiving end. And kids then, when given the opportunity to exploit that same power imbalance with their peers, will be more inclined to bully. But we can't just point to the family as the sole location of risk factors for bullying. There are a number of factors at school that can contribute to bullying's occurrence and continuation. Lack of supervision, especially during break time, creates vacuums, opportunities for bullying to take place when no adult is around to interrupt it. The closer we keep our eye on kids, not like surveillance, keeping our eye on them, but just paying attention, being around, noticing where behaviors are likely to occur, and our physical presence, especially when kids know it's not tolerated, will deter bullying from taking place in a lot of situations. When students have indifferent or accepting attitudes towards bullying, and along with that, when staff have indifferent or accepting attitude towards bullying, when the norm is that, well, this stuff is not nice, but it happens. That's just part of the developmental process, and we don't really nip it in the bud when it happens, don't hold kids accountable. Those are risk factors at school that we have control over. So we have an obligation to address bullying and do the things that I had mentioned earlier to prevent it. Help encourage positive relationships with kids. Help instill those moral obligations in kids' minds so that they know that certain things are just wrong. They're unacceptable behaviors. Well, here's a touchy subject: adults who bully. Not only may adults have indifferent or accepting attitudes about bullying, some adults actually bully others, both students and colleagues. There are a lot of books and research on adult bullying that show parallels with student bullying. Some adults lack good management skills and use power to show that they are in control. Generally, dealing with adults in a building who bully is going to be an administrator responsibility. As I look at a list here put together by a woman named Linda Starr, S-T-A-R-R, in Education World, which you might want to Google yourself, it's got a number of pairs of statements that are probably worthwhile to be aware of, just to guard against becoming a bullying adult yourself in a school setting. Listed are educators versus bullies. Educators let students know they care. Bullies let students know who's boss. Educators teach self-control. Bullies exert their own control. Educators diffuse minor disruptions with humor. Bullies use sarcasm to turn disruptions into confrontations. Educators help all students feel successful. Bullies punish students for being unsuccessful. Educators see each student's uniqueness. Bullies compare children to one another. Educators educate. Bullies humiliate. Anyway, I don't have an easy solution for this, but every time we talk about the topic of bullying, somebody either brings it up or is thinking to themselves, you know what? The kids aren't the only problem in my building. So I want to acknowledge that that's an issue, and hopefully you won't become part of it yourself. Well, there are a number of misdirections, mistakes in bullying prevention and intervention. And some of these, again, are beyond your decision-making level as a paraprofessional, but just to be aware of some of the things that research has demonstrated does not work. Simple short-term solutions or programme du jour approaches. There are a lot of fashionable approaches to bullying that really haven't been demonstrated as being effective. You really need to try to get at the school climate, and it's a pretty pervasive, deep, long-term kind of approach that's going to be much more effective than something that's portrayed as a quick fix. Getting together kids who bully and putting them in a group is typically not a good idea. They're going to feed off each other, and it's probably just going to intensify the problem. They don't really confront each other unless they're going to bully each other in the group, but group treatment is not generally a good approach. Anger management or self-esteem enhancement for kids who bully. Kids who bully don't do it out of anger. They're not angry at something that the bullied student did. They see this as an opportunity to boost up their ego, to exploit that power imbalance that places them at the top, and it's not an anger issue. Also, I said before, it's not a self-esteem thing. Kids probably have a little excess of self-esteem and need to be a bit more humble and empathetic, and learn that they cannot exploit any advantage or superiority they feel they have with other kids. Zero tolerance policies for bullying. Now, I got to clarify this because there are different kinds of zero tolerance interpretations. Most schools have zero tolerance for major conduct violations: drugs, weapons, serious physical harm, assault to another student. And in those situations, there is typically an immediate suspension. Depending on the student's IEP status, that might end up being a change to a more restrictive setting. Not always, but that's always an option that's considered. Expelling or suspending students for any bullying behavior is generally not an effective way to deal with them. You want the kids in school to deal with, to deliver some negative consequences, but not to just boot them from school. Now, zero tolerance interpreted as you intervene at low levels of behavior, of misbehavior. That's the kind of zero tolerance that is desirable. You don't ignore low-level bullying behaviors. You confront it every time, and that's how you communicate to kids that this kind of behavior is not allowed. So that's the kind of zero tolerance which is effective, not just booting kids from school. Mediation and conflict resolution to resolve bullying issues. You do mediation and you do conflict resolution for kids who, for example, have squared off fights. We talked earlier about the distinction between rough and tumble play, bullying, and fighting. Students who have fights, or whether even if they're not physical, having head-to-head disagreements that are excessive and not mutually respectful, that's when you do mediation and conflict resolution. But that presupposes there is no power imbalance, that they have equal status, equal abilities to be able to resolve this and listen to one another's side and compromise. Bullying and the power imbalance that it involves makes mediation and conflict resolution not a good idea, because a bullied student sitting across the table with a student who repeatedly has bullied him and intimidates him and exploits that difference basically is just an adult supervised exercise in having the bullying continue, because it's not a fair, even matchup. So that's the reason why mediation and conflict resolution are not the appropriate ways to resolve bullying issues. Well, if you're going to establish norms and expectations in schools, you need to have policies and rules in place. And this would be both at a district level, district-wide, and by building, which lists what behaviors are prohibited and lists positives or at least negative consequences for violating those rules. Fortunately, in Iowa, in 2007, the Iowa legislature mandated every school district in Iowa had to have a policy prohibiting harassment and bullying in the schools. And the language was pretty much handed to the districts, and Dubuque and every other school district in our AEA and in the state have adopted this. School district conduct policies typically are pretty clear on the possible consequences for serious violations of these. Usually at the administrative level in schools, the consequences are up to principals and a lot of times teachers. Positive consequences are not always spelled out quite so neatly, but they're important too. Students need to be reinforced and acknowledged when they engage in a lot of positive activities, whether it's just respectful behavior with peers, but also when they take steps to intervene in bullying situations. We need to recognize those and encourage those behaviors in kids. Most schools have rules that govern student behavior, but many don't exactly or explicitly address bullying using that term. The Olweus organization recommends that schools adopt these 4 rules, and the schools that have adopted the Olweus program pretty much adopt these with sometimes a little modification. It's interesting that the first rule addresses children who bully. We will not bully others, but the other 3 focus on bystander behavior. And the expectation is that all students won't bully and will also take action to help students who are bullied. The 4th rule applies to students being bullied themselves, not just bystanders. I also find it interesting that the first one is the only one that says what's not allowed. The other 3 prescribe certain behaviors. Trying to help students who are bullied. That requires some discussion with kids about, well, what can you do? What are some good choices? What are some good options? Given these circumstances, when would it be not good to, for example, confront or take on directly a student who's doing bullying? I will try to include students who are left out. Now that's a big preventive rule. That's something I referred to earlier when we talked about trying to choreograph, if you will, and encourage interactions and relationships and activities with kids who wouldn't necessarily be involved with one another. But if you do have the opportunity to have a positive interaction with someone, you're less inclined to mistreat that person in another setting. The last one really appeals to me because it recognizes that your parents at home have a significant role in this too. They need to know what's going on, and whether you're reporting to the parent that you were bullied or reporting to your parent that you saw it happening at school, it increases their awareness. It's going to encourage more school-parent collaboration and communication. So I sort of like these rules. Even if they're not explicitly adopted by a school district or by a building, there are things that we can teach students, and as we help them try to maneuver through their days and deal with bullying. Adults at home and school often expect students to behave in positive ways and focus only on negative consequences when they do something wrong. But research shows that when students receive positive consequences for behavior, they're more likely to repeat the desired behavior. Positive consequences are important for climate change, and they help support a new way for students to view stepping in to help instead of just watching. It's important to use these positive consequences for following rules 2 and 4 in that list of school rules. Just to refresh your memory, rules 2, 3, and 4, trying to help students who are bullied, trying to include students who are left out, and letting someone at school and at home know if they see someone as being bullied. I'm not going to prescribe a whole bunch of positive consequences, but this might be a good time to pause, whether you're by yourself or with a group, and just brainstorm some positive consequences you can use. And some of these might be more formal, some formal recognition on paper or a bulletin board or giving out awards and certificates. But a lot of positive consequences just involve our immediate personal reinforcement verbally to students when we see them doing behavior that's appropriate and expected. So take a little pause, spend a minute or two, and just see if you can come up with a list of yourself, of your own. And it's worthwhile talking to folks back in your home schools about this too. How do you reinforce students for appropriate behaviors? Well, just like positive consequences are real important, using them is not necessarily sufficient, and a lot of times you need to have some negative consequences to encourage aggressive students to stop bullying. Some things to keep in mind are it should be something that's somewhat disagreeable or uncomfortable, but should not involve revenge or hostile punishment. It's got to be fairly easy to use, and you want to have it be appropriate for the student's age, gender, and personality. What's negative or aversive to one student might not necessarily be so for another. Some students dislike going off for recess in the first place, and losing recess might not be that big a deal for them. Some examples of negative consequences include verbal rebukes or reprimands. So just expressing our displeasure face to face is a negative consequence. It doesn't have to be some formal thing. Relationships are important, and having someone who's important to a student express dissatisfaction, displeasure, that frequently is a sufficient negative consequence. Timeouts are sort of a standard thing in school, but there's an awful lot of things you got to take into consideration in terms of location and duration. What else? Response costs. That's the term for a student losing a privilege or having to give up something positive, like watching a movie or going to a field trip. You should be familiar with the existing negative consequences in your school. Talk with your team about it, your teachers, your administrators. Again, I'm not going to give a list of prescribed negative consequences, but those are usually an important part of the package in terms of how you respond to bullying behavior. Well, this slide includes some things which I acknowledge are beyond your control as paraprofessionals, but it's good for you to be aware of some of the components of an expansive, well thought out, school-wide school climate program that focuses on bullying and respect. Whatever your rules are, you want to have them posted and enforced school-wide so that students know that these are important. They're an important part of our school culture. Talking about them with students regularly in a classroom setting, whether it's with meetings, as the Alveus program does, or the PBIS program does, and having meetings, having conversations with students' parents as well. So they're aware of what school expectations are, they can enforce it and adopt similar expectations at home. Parents are looking for and typically will welcome guidance when schools make it clear how they can work together as a team. So enough said on that, I guess, for the time being. So let's talk a bit about individual level components. How do you deal with individual students and situations when bullying occurs? First of all, close supervision of students' activities is real key. We need to identify students who are most vulnerable and support and protect them, especially in those hotspot areas where bullying is most likely to occur. We also need to identify those kids who are most likely to do bullying so we can stop and redirect their behavior. So paying attention and talking to colleagues will help you identify those students. We also want to motivate the majority of student bystanders to help their classmates, because most bullying situations happen when there isn't an adult around. You'd be surprised to find out how much bullying takes place in the classroom with the teacher present, but majority does take place outside of our line of hearing, out of our line of sight, and training kids to intervene, to do what they can to interrupt bullying and to let adults know that it happened is real important. Establishing the norm, the expectation that all staff intervene on the spot when bullying occurs is real important. And we'll talk about that in the very next slide. Well, 2 slides down the line, excuse me. Holding meetings with students who are involved in bullying, and that's generally a teacher or a counselor or administrative responsibility, but be aware that that's something that's important to do after a bullying incident. You can't just stop it and hope that it won't happen again. And frequently we'll have individual intervention plans for involved students. So, just before I talk about how to intervene when bullying occurs, let's spend 1 slide talking about why adults don't always intervene. We typically overestimate how often we do this. Research of adults illustrates that 70% of teachers believe that we intervene almost always when bullying happens, but only 25% of students, when they're surveyed, they feel that teachers intervene almost always. The reason we don't, and these are perhaps understandable, but not really legitimate reasons. Sometimes we don't recognize bullying. We think it might be just kidding around, that horseplay, that rough and tumble play, and don't really recognize it as bullying. And sometimes it is subtle enough that it's not that apparent to the observer. Sometimes we don't realize the importance of intervening. We just sometimes think, well, it's just part of growing up, and kids learn to deal with situations. They need to learn to deal with situations in their own. Sometimes we're not quite sure, just like those kids in the bullying circle who know it's wrong, but really don't know what to do, even if they want to do something. Sometimes it's just a time factor. We figure we've only got 1 or 2 minutes to address this, and if I can't address it adequately, well, I'm just sort of going to hope that it ends, it's brief, it's not that big of an issue, and it's a time factor. Some other reasons are we might not be sure about administrative support or colleague support from our teachers in intervening. Sometimes we're worried about parent responding. Sometimes we're worried about if we intervene, it's going to just escalate it and make it worse, because we know some of those kids who aren't necessarily real receptive to and deferential to adult intervention. So, you see and or hear a bullying incident. What do? There's a 6-step sequence here which we call on-the-spot interventions. It's a teachable moment. Remember, you're after more than just confronting that student A, students A and B if you've got supporters, and rescuing student H. You've got other students around who are going to be part of what your response is going to be. The sequence is, and I'll walk through these first, and then I'll backtrack and give you some examples of what this sounds like and looks like. You stop the bullying. Now, generally, your physical approach and presence will result in the bullying ending. But you may need to say, okay, stop. Number 2, you support the student who has been bullied. Now, depending on the circumstance, the setting, you want to do this efficiently, but not make a big production and gush over the student to add to any more social awkwardness or embarrassment than is already there. Number 3, you name the bullying behavior and refer to the school rules. You state what you just saw or what you just heard and make it clear, we have rules against bullying. This was bullying behavior. Number 4, engage the bystanders. Now this is something that we typically are used to doing. This may be telling them, reminding them what their obligation is if this happens. If you were aware of a bystander trying to intervene, you want to reinforce that. Empower them with appreciation if they were supportive to the student who was bullied. Step 5, impose immediate and appropriate consequences. There might be something you need to do right there to isolate, to consecrate that bullying student. Perhaps at recess, for example, you need to go stand against the wall or the fence for the rest of recess, and I'll talk to you more later. Or you need to go sit at this other table at lunchtime, or whatever, immediate consequence. It may include, depending on the severity, telling the student, you need to go to the office right now, and I or someone else will be talking to you in a few minutes. Number 6, take steps to ensure the bullied student will be protected from future bullying. This will be addressed later in the office when you have a one-to-one conversation with the bullied student, but you may need to again make a statement to bystanders. If this ever happens again, you need to do something to stop it. That's your obligation. That's one of our school rules. So here's what this may sound like. I'll state the number as I go down and state my examples or speak them. Number 1. All right, everybody stop. Stay here. Don't leave. Number 2. I'm sorry this happened to you. Are you okay? Or, to a bystander, can you walk with him to the nurse? Or, why don't you go get another lunch right now? Or, do you have your books? They've been knocked on the floor. Or, I can get you to the office. Or, can you get to the office? I'll be there in a minute and talk to you. 3, to the student who was doing the bullying. You just slammed his locker on him. Or, you knocked his books on the floor. Or, I heard you just calling her names. Or, you pushed and hit her. Or, you told her she couldn't sit here and eat lunch. This is against our school rules about bullying. Number 4, depending on their appropriate response or failure to respond. I'm glad someone alerted me that this was happening. Or, thanks for trying to step in. Or, if you see bullying happening, you're expected to try to help. Or, when you laugh or even stand and watch, you're not helping, you're making it worse. You're not following the rule to help. Number 5, you need to pick up his books right now and give them to him. You just knocked them down. Or, you need to go sit in the bleachers right now for the rest of lunch or the rest of recess. Or, you need to apologize. We're going to talk later in the office. Or, you need to go to the office and wait for me right now. Number 6, this could be a statement again to bystanders that if you see something like this happening again, you need to either stop it or get an adult to help. Most situations, those steps to ensure that a bullied student will be protected from future bullying is going to come out of your conversation in the office with the bullied student and subsequent conversation with the bullying student. Again, it's most likely that if you're doing the on-the-spot, somebody in the office is going to get the details and the facts from you and do those one-to-one interviews, which are more elaborate and that I'm sharing with you in this training right now. But there is an obligation on the part of the adults to remain aware and vigilant for both students to make sure that the bullied student is protected in the future and the bullying student is aware that people are paying attention and will not be allowing this behavior to continue. So there are times when we don't see bullying firsthand. It's subtle, it's done when there are no adults around. It relies on this code of silence that peers are not going to report it. And we haven't instilled that obligation in kids yet. So look for warning signs. Kids spending time alone during lunch or recess, perhaps because they're afraid to interact with others who might bully them. Kids acting anxious or depressed. You overhear other kids talking about it. If you are suspicious, just pay more attention. Confer with other colleagues. You might not see things, but other people might. And your little bit of evidence combined with little bits of evidence from 2 or 3 or 4 other people may add up to a pretty strong case that bullying is going on. Talk to kids. Kids, if you establish yourself as a good listener, kids will tell you a lot of stuff. So collect information from them. Contact parents. Again, some of these, including this one I suspect, is going to be a responsibility of a teacher, a counselor, or a principal. But kids will sometimes tell things to their parents at home that they won't disclose at school. So there are a lot of sources of information that school folks can rely upon and draw on to try to reach a conclusion about whether bullying is happening and then be able to take appropriate measures at school. Oh, without elaborating at great length, I'm just going to include a slide here just titled Understanding Parents' Perspectives. Bullying elicits strong feelings among parents, whether their child is being bullied or whether their child is accused of bullying. Parents need to be contacted when students are engaged in or are bullied, and there are assorted resources that are available with a lot of the bullying materials that are up in Al-Qaeda, and teachers and administrators can sign those things out. There are tip sheets, for example, for parents of children who are bullied, parents of kids who bully others, and parents of kids who witness bullying. And those are probably good resources to take a look at, which I'm not going to get into in more detail here, but just recognize how you would feel if you got a call from your kid's school knowing that your child was either being bullied or bullying, or if your child reported to you that he or she was being bullied and you had to call school. Not everybody has a spectacular relationship as a parent with their school folks for a whole bunch of reasons, some historical that have nothing to do with their own child. But just recognize that parents are not adversaries. They are partners, and we have to collaborate with them. They deserve the respect and compassion that we would want in turn if it was us in their shoes. Well, the original Ulvaeus program in Europe did not have this community level component piece, but in the U.S. we found that to be real important to involve the community. They can help support schools' efforts in a lot of ways. They can provide publicity, both in print and TV, to spread the anti-bullying message throughout the community. They can provide funding, sponsorship of various promotional and positive consequence items, food and gift certificates, t-shirts, billboards. There are folks in the community who are really looking for opportunities to collaborate with schools to our mutual benefits. And again, these are administrative and teacher and counselor responsibilities, but in your conversation with your coworkers and your superiors at school, I don't think it's out of line for you to mention that route, that avenue, as a possible way to get some more mileage out of your anti-bullying efforts. So go for it. So, you've seen the contents of this slide before. Bullying, just like everything in school, is a team effort. And while you do not have the control and responsibility for a lot of components, a lot of decisions in schools, as a paraprofessional, you still have a pretty big impact. You have an awful lot of kid interaction, and most of the kids look at you as almost equal in status to every other adult in school. So recognize that, play your part, realize this is the long-term process, and you're important. So, one more slide. Well, this is the last slide with the fine print, which again points out the number of people involved in the content, creating the content of this presentation. As I said before, there are a whole bunch of bullying resources available with the Keystone Media Library up in Elkader. Pursue those. A lot of them are Olweus materials, but there are other materials from other providers as well. Google Olweus, O-L-W-E-U-S, and you'll find a lot of resources there. www.stopbullying.gov also has a lot of resources, a lot of them for free. DVDs, cartoons for kids to watch, awful lot of printed materials, so feel free to make use of those. Thank you for your time. I hope this was useful, and feel free to contact me, by the way. My email is SHEER@AEA1, that's the number 1, not the word 1, AEA1.K12.IA.US. I work out of the Dubuque office. So, phone number is 563-556-3310, extension 2716. Thank you.